Hello, good evening, everybody. As we know, there's a fascination with the JFK assassination, and interest is escalating because of the Trump announcement to release the files, the declassification. And this evening, we have got with us Jefferson Morley, who is the author of a book featuring a very bizarre character, a chief from the CIA called James Jesus Angleton. So the link for the book is in the description box, as is Jeff's Substack. So please support his important work. And if you've got questions, put them in the chat. We are live. We'll take your questions. But first, I'm going to try and get Jeff to tell us as much as possible about how he got into this and his work and the book and everything else. Huge thank you for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me.
What got you piqued about the JFK assassination then?
When I first started working at the Washington Post in 1992, that was the year Oliver Stone's movie came out. And I'd been at the Post. I'd been a journalist in Washington for about 8 years, and I became an editor at the Post. I was familiar with the JFK story. I'd read a few books, read the Warren Commission report, didn't really have any strong opinion about it. Was kind of puzzled by it, but thought this happened so long ago that there's nothing I can do. I can't interview anybody or anything like that. I didn't really think about it. Then after Stone's movie became a big hit and there was a furious debate, Congress passed a law called the JFK Records Act. And what Congress said was really very sensible. It was a very positive move by Congress. They said, we're going to release all of the government's records on this subject, all of them. And, people had pointed the finger at Oliver Stone and said, you bad boy, how dare you take record, question the official story and take liberties with the facts. And of course, JFK is a Hollywood movie. It's not a documentary. So of course, the facts are tailored to make them more cinematic. But Stone had done a tremendous amount of work. The story was not made up. The story that he told was not made up. So Stone put a trailer in the movie, and he said at the end of the movie, by the way, 90% of the US government's records on this subject are still secret 30 years after the event itself. So Congress was inundated with mail from people saying, this is ridiculous. You have to release all of this. So Congress did the right thing. They passed a law and they released all the records. Well, not only that, but they didn't just do it at the stroke of a pen. They created a real independent, trustworthy process where they had an outside review board, not people from the government, not people from government agencies, with the authority to go to federal agencies, say, please produce your JFK records. We're going to review them for privacy, national security, et cetera. And then we'll release them. And so this process went on in the 1990s, 1994 to 1998. Well, when this board got going, I realized right away there was going to be an avalanche of material because, I knew that there were thousands of pages. And so that's when I got interested, because I thought there's going to be something new here. I don't have to just rehash old information or rehash old theories. And I didn't have a theory, and I still don't have a theory. That's not really how I work as a reporter. You're trying to accumulate information, and then you look for patterns in the information. That tells you something. So that's how I got going in 1992. And I focused on, what did the CIA think about the Kennedy assassination? One of the striking things was, nobody in the US government lost their job. The President of the United States is gunned down in broad daylight. The Secret Service isn't fired. The head of the Secret Service isn't fired. A few agents are mildly disciplined, not fired. Head of the FBI, not fired. Head of the CIA, not fired. Nobody lost their job. So what did the CIA think had happened, right? And I knew enough about the CIA. And this is really where I kind of came in to the story in a different way than a lot of people. While I was familiar with the whole literature of conspiracy, I didn't have a theory. I didn't think any of the theories that I read were particularly convincing. I didn't find the official story very convincing either. I just didn't know what to think. So as I focused on this new body of records, what did the CIA know about the assassination? And in particular, what did they know about Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who supposedly killed the president? In this curious story, he had been a defector in the Soviet Union. So that kind of interested me. And I had previously covered the CIA for the New Republic and The Nation magazines in Washington, and writing about civil war in Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, which was the really hot issue of the 80s in America, U.S. intervention in Central America. And when I was covering that story, you quickly realized, if you were a serious reporter, you had to know what the CIA was doing, because their presence was clearly, just, you could tell it was big. But I didn't have a security clearance. I didn't have any friends in the CIA. So I had to figure out how to report about the CIA on my own. And through that, I began to learn the history of the CIA in Cuba, history of the CIA in Latin America. And so that gave me a certain background when I came to the JFK story, not in conspiracy theories, but in how the CIA worked. And so that always informed my reporting about what was going on back in 1963. So I was working at the Washington Post and started publishing stories there. The first one in 1994 I found a woman, Jane Roman, who had worked at the CIA and who was an aide to James Angleton, the man who many years later I would write a book about. I didn't even know that about Jane Roman when I interviewed her. I had just seen her name on some declassified CIA records that had been released under this law. So I did an interview with Jane Roman, and she said some very interesting things about the CIA and Oswald. So that got me started. And my original insight that there would be good stories in those records, that insight is earning my living to this day. There are really great stories in there, and people are coming to appreciate it, which brings us to President Trump. So how did we get into this? Well, this JFK Records Act passed unanimously by Congress. And first of all, imagine that. The U.S. Congress, 435 members, every one of them agreed that this was a good idea. Every Democrat and every Republican. Basically will not going to happen anytime soon in America. Okay. But this was one thing everybody was behind. So the law was very strong. And what the law said was all government agencies have to produce their records, and we're going to review and release them. And so that process was going on in the 1990s, and tons of stuff came into the record. I was working on it. We began to see the assassination in a whole new light. As I did that, the review board only existed for 4 years, 1994 to 1998. And by that time, they had done the bulk of the job, and they only had funding for 4 years. So they pushed out a couple million pages, very important. But what the law said was government agencies can request postponement of release of JFK records. They don't have, if they make a case to the review board. And so the agencies came to the review board and said, look, this is a very sensitive matter. We couldn't possibly release that. This is what they said in the 90s. And so the review board would say, okay, we'll give you 10 more years, or you can have until 2017. That was, so basically most of the documents were released in the 90s. And then we had this schedule of release where things were released more slowly for privacy and national security reasons primarily. And that continued on through the 2000s. But the law said that after 25 years, 2017, everything that the review board had found that was quote unquote assassination related, and they did a good legal definition of how to define an assassination related record. The law said all of these records have to be made public. It's a sunset provision, right? It's like end of story. Okay. So In 2017, there were still about 15,000 different documents, most of them CIA, probably 12,000 of them CIA, the bulk of the rest FBI and other agencies. They were still requesting redactions in 15,000, 16,000 different documents. So in October of 2017, it was supposed to happen. It was supposed to come out. Well, Mike Pompeo, the Trump's first CIA director, came to him and said, you can't release this stuff. So accounts of that meeting vary widely. Trump has his account, which has changed a few times. Pompeo has his account. We have some of the wire service reporters picked up on it at the time, and that's another account. But the bottom line was Trump went along with the Pompeo decision that the CIA didn't want to release this. And Chris Wray said the same thing about FBI. And so Trump did the Trump thing. He put out a tweet and said all the records are released ahead of time, so which wasn't true. All the records weren't released ahead of time, and the ones that were released behind time. So, and he basically kicked the can down the road and said the CIA and FBI can make stuff public if they want, but we're not going to make them do anything they don't want to do, and we'll revisit the whole thing in 4 years. So that was Trump's order in October 2017, and in April of 2018, the agencies released a bunch more records, took off redactions in more records. So there was the declassification process did continue. So then after four years, October 2021, the issue came to Biden, who's now the president. So Biden said, well, we're just coming out of COVID, and we'll give the agencies another year. So, you know, the Washington Post called me up and they said, Jeff, what do you think of this? You know, and I said, you know, this is the COVID dog ate my homework excuse. You know, it's like they're 25 years. They're supposed to do it in 25 years. They had 4 more years to do it, 29 years. And, oh, we just need a little more time to do it. Come on. Anyway, they got another year. So in December 2022, Biden issues another order. More stuff comes out. And there's a slow motion declassification through the spring of 2023. And at that point, there are now about 3,600 documents left in the government's JFK records collection. Okay. And what Biden did was Biden issued an order in June of 2023. And he said, look, this is my last order. From now on, the president's not going to decide on this. The CIA has drawn up these transparency plans that have a schedule for release of the rest of these records. So we're just going to follow the transparency plans written by the CIA and the NSA, which have no timetable in them. And if you read them carefully, all of these documents could be postponed till, we think, 2044. So, you know, the CIA transparency plan, you know that a CIA transparency plan is going to be designed to prevent transparency somewhere. So, but the Biden rule was in effect, and basically that was the end of the pipeline. There was no more JFK documents declassified after June 2020. So that was like you know, locked in the tomb, you know, like it kind of over. I mean, and that's when we decided, we being the Mary Farrell Foundation, which sponsors the largest online collection of JFK records at maryfarrell.org. We sued and we said, this is a farce. And we asked the courts to step in. So that's still going on at glacial pace in federal court in California. So that was the reality that Trump inherited as he came to office. Now, Trump himself was, you know, you wonder if the guy's capable of being embarrassed, but I think he was a little embarrassed by the fact that he caved on the JFK records, because even his most loyal acolytes in the press, you know, people who are very fervently supportive of him, questioned him and said, why did you do that? And Tucker Carlson, you know, gave him a hard time and gave Pompeo a really hard time for doing this. And Andrew Napolitano, pressed him on it. And Trump always sounded a little sheepish when he was responding to those people. So, but he wasn't really talking about it too much during the campaign until Robert Kennedy came along. Robert Kennedy, when he was running as a Democrat, made this a big deal, or not a big deal, but a centerpiece of his message was, we're going to release all the records related to the murder of my father and my uncle. And he said that he believed the CIA was involved in the murder of his uncle, in the murder of JFK. And he was very serious about that. He started an online petition that got thousands of signatures, and he talked about it occasionally. And then he dropped out and he jumped over to Trump. Well, at that rally in Arizona, where RFK appeared with Trump and said he was endorsing him, Trump said, and we're going to release all of the JFK papers. And if you see the tape of the rally, Trump gets this really big round of applause when he says this JFK thing. And I'm sure he remembered that, it's like, this is a good line. This is a good line. This is an applause line, And so he kind of committed himself publicly to it again. And then he talked about it on Joe Rogan, which was kind of like, he's making his final case, why you should elect me, and that was part of it. It was, and we're going to release all of the JFK records. So, I think politically a good message. If you look at the polls, 70% of the people say just release it all. People can't believe, like, why is it's even, asking about it. So very popular majority position, not a divisive position, but a popular one. So now he's in power, or coming to power. What's he going to do? So that led to the order on January 22nd, where Trump issued an executive order, said we want a full and complete release of JFK records, and I want a plan from my aides in 15 days. So we're expecting that 15 days will be Friday. So we're expecting that plan maybe on Friday, maybe on Monday. So people call and say, Jeff, this is your thing. What do you think? And in this great news, and it's very good news that the president has committed himself to this. But, he changed his mind before, and, Biden went along with the CIA. So, just don't count your chickens, because if you think that the CIA is going to change their handling of JFK records because some president came and signed a piece of paper, you don't understand how Washington works. Okay. The CIA is pushing back very hard. Now, how hard can they push back, and how hard are the Trump people going to push on them? I'm sure that they're having a serious discussion about this right now, because there are people in the national security establishment who are going to go along with what Pompeo and Ray said and said, you can't possibly release this stuff. It'll harm U.S. foreign policy. And people like Marco Rubio might weigh in and say, yeah, don't do it. We don't want to screw up our foreign policy with Cuba or with Mexico or with Russia, all of whom, might be somehow implicated in some way in stories emerging from the JFK files. So, so we'll see. And we'll see a plan. Now, will we see documents right away? I mean, these documents are held in the National Archives, which has a building called Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. These records are held there. So if anybody wants to go and see them and release them, it could be done in 48 hours. I mean, it's not complicated. Now, there's other records that are held by the agencies themselves that are assassination related, and getting those records out of the agency's hands, that's another challenge for Trump, because it's not as simple as just saying, let's get the ones in the National Archives. If the CIA, controls the document, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? So what's going to happen? So the first thing is, what is the Trump plan? What does it say? What does it come out and say? And that could vary a great deal. A couple of congressmen here in Washington have offered some constructive support for Trump, and they wrote him a letter. Congressman Steve Cohen, liberal Democrat from Memphis, Tennessee, David Schweikert, conservative Republican from suburban Phoenix, Arizona, and Congressman Tim Burchett, a conservative Republican from Knoxville area. And they came forward with a letter and they said, look, great news, President Trump, thank you. Here's how to do it. And both Cohen and Schweikert had actually thought about this and written down legislation. And so they kind of said, what they need to do. Cohen's idea, or Schweikert's idea, is rapid declassification at 6 agencies, hard deadlines, overseen by Senate Intelligence or House Intelligence. And Cohen's idea was create an independent board like the board we had in the 90s, outsiders, so it's a credible process, give them the power, tell them to go look for all records. So they weren't introducing legislation. They were just saying, here's how to do this right. And those are very sound ideas. You can't do this at the stroke of a pen. These are highly sensitive records controlled by jealous agencies that are prone to destruction and deception. And so we need a transparent process because it's obviously an important issue to Americans if they're still talking about it after 60 years. And Trump's talking about it in the closing days of a presidential election, and he's putting a lot of prestige on it. So can we get the records? So it's a great first step. We need this kind of implementation that the Congressman Cohen and Schweikert are talking about. That would really help make this happen. So that's where things stand right now. Now, there's also kind of the bigger politics of the situation, which we're going to find out very shortly, okay? And that's the nominations of Robert F. Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, and Kash Patel, probably the 3 most controversial of Trump's cabinet appointments. And so Robert Kennedy is probably not going to be involved in this process because he really wants to do that medical thing and the vaccines and the food. That's his baby. I mean, he's made his views clear, but he's not going to implement this. Okay. And that's appropriate. It's actually, there are JFK records in possession of his family, for example, that should be made public. Right. So he needs to step out of the process and keep it at an arm's length. Thanks for his contribution and his personal interest. That's very important to this. But it's also appropriate that he not be directly involved. Tulsi Gabbard, as DNI, if she's confirmed, she's one of the officials who's supposed to write the plan for Trump. So we should find out about her nomination these 2 nominations, I think tomorrow or maybe the next day, maybe even tonight, because I guess Kennedy passed some of the committees today. Anyway, that will make a big difference because Robert Kennedy's more committed to the issue than Trump, right? I mean, Trump's interests are usually transactional, which is what's in it for Trump. And, last time around, he traded the JFK files because he got something else out of the deal, right? So he might do that again. But if Robert Kennedy's there with his personal stake, Trump's not going to want to lose face with RFK, not on this issue. So he's kind of, by his public commitment, I think he's really committed himself to it. But to have RFK there, and Tulsi Gabbard, also, skeptic of the national security agencies and all their claims, and she'll actually have a role in writing the plan. And Kash Patel, who has talked specifically and even said that he's seen the JFK records. Not a statement that I'm sure I believe, but he does say it, and he is interested in the issue. So, and at FBI, there are FBI documents that are important that are still withheld. So what happens with these nominees will affect the plan, and we'll see what happens with the plan. That's kind of the landscape as we go forward. So very promising, but I say, having watched these guys for a long time, don't count your chickens.
Well, thank you very much for that update. So, viewers, we've got almost 1,000 watching live now. I'm here with Jefferson Morley, and we're about to enter the very strange world of ex-CIA chief and spy master James Jesus Angleton.
Yes.
So, Jeff has written a book, The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA spy master James Jesus Angleton. The link is in the description box, as is his Substack. I'll just read some of the quotes from Amazon the best book ever written about the strangest CIA chief who ever lived, a revelatory new biography of the sinister, powerful, and paranoid man at the heart of the CIA for more than 3 tumultuous decades. And he was instrumental in frustrating the investigation and enabling the cover-up. Anyway, I've come across this guy over the years, and I've heard snippets, but I've never had someone put the story together. So I can't wait to hear this.
Yeah, well, Angleton is a fascinating character, and he's really famous in a way. He became the archetype of a certain kind of American spy, not the born Bond type spy, but the spy is intellectual. And that was Angleton. He was, he was kind of crazy, but people who knew him, very smart people who knew him, thought he was a genius, and especially people in the CIA. And he was a very clever, brilliant man. He ultimately brought down by alcoholism and driven mad, I think. But in his prime, a very impressive man. Comes up from his father's a self-made millionaire, and Angleton grew up first in the United States, and then in the 30s, his father got the National Cash Register franchise in Milan, Italy. And so, these cash registers, this was like the high tech of its day, and especially after World War I in Italy. And so Hugh Angleton and his young teenage son and his family moved to Milan. So Angleton grew up in the United States in kind of modest circumstances. His father hit it big, and they lived in a palazzo in Milan, and he lived very well. Went to boarding school in England, Malvern College, and then from there came back to the United States and went to Yale. So by 18, he's a very cosmopolitan guy, certainly compared to his sort of preppy provincial classmates. He's lived in several countries, traveled widely, speaks Italian, French, and English, and is a very precocious and brilliant guy. During World War II, he goes into the Office of Strategic Services, America's peacetime intelligence agency, and he gets intelligence training. But he brings to the job of espionage kind of the creativity and imagination of a poet or a literary critic, kind of studying texts and interpreting texts. And as an undergraduate, Angleton had befriended some of the major poets of the day, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, to name two of them, and impressed them and got them to write for his undergraduate magazine, and knew how to appeal to men of power. And so he brings these skills to espionage, and which brings him back to England. And I think your audience will appreciate that. He comes back to England during 1944 to receive training for the OSS. This is America's first venture into a foreign intelligence agency. And frankly, they didn't know what they were doing. And so they send all these guys over there, and they say to the MI6, please train these guys, in espionage and tradecraft and all that. And so they go to school. And the OSS veterans, led by none other than Kim Philby, teach the Americans and these young, smart men like Jim Angleton how to be spies, how to do covert action, how to, fly in behind enemy lines, all of that sort of thing. And Angleton gets this crash course in espionage, and he becomes friends with Philby. And then because he's fluent in Italian and has great connections in Italy, he's sent to Rome in late 1944 to run counterintelligence operations there. So the Allied invasion of Europe is progressing. The Allied armies moving up through Italy in 1944. Mussolini's in retreat. The Nazis are falling back into Germany, driven out of France. So the war is going well, and Angleton goes and he's running spies and intercepting German spies and Italian spies, and again impressing everybody around him with his brilliance, his wide range of acquaintances, his keen imagination. So he's a kind of a rising star in the OSS. The war ends, and Harry Truman, the new president of the United States after Franklin Roosevelt died, decides that they're going to abolish the OSS. They're not going to have a peacetime intelligence agency. And this was a big debate at the time, was, do you have a peacetime intelligence agency? In war, yeah, you need one. But in peace, do you really give an organization these powers of secrecy, law breaking, all of that? And Truman said, no, we don't want an American Gestapo. And this was a phrase that a lot of opponents of creating a central intelligence agency said. We don't want an American Gestapo. There's too much chance that it could go wrong and could become a secret police. So Angleton goes to work. They kind of split up the OSS and sent peace to the military, a peace to the State Department. And Angleton kind of hangs on in one of these interim jobs. And 2 years later, the Cold War has accelerated, right? Churchill's given the Iron Curtain speech. You've got a civil war in Greece. The communists are very strong in Italy. And Congress passes the National Security Act, and they say, we do want a CIA. And they create a CIA. And Truman comes to Truman, and he reverses himself. And when he signs the bill into existence, he said, we need to make sure that the CIA doesn't become an American Gestapo, but we need this agency. And so the CIA is created, and rising star Jim Angleton goes to work right away for them as a foreign intelligence officer. So he's close to the leaders of the agency, to Allen Dulles, and he impresses them. And the first big operation he's involved in is the Italian elections of 1948. Socialists are running strong. CIA intervenes, spreads a lot of money around to the Christian Democrats, a lot of money to the Vatican, where Angleton already had good connections. So the Christian Democrats pull out this victory, and Angleton gets a lot of the credit back at the CIA. So he's a rising star. The Cold War is now in earnest, and any, peace idea of a peaceful cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States, the two countries that won the war, is over, right? The two countries are at each other's throats, basically, except they both got nuclear weapons. So neither of them can afford to attack the other. So it's kind of this deadly standoff. But with these both countries are building up their nuclear arsenals very rapidly. We're into the Cold War. Angleton, now in the Cold War, this young CIA is up against the KGB, right? Well, we just got started, right? So we're just going to school with the Brits, right? We're learning, how do you do this? Now, you guys, the Brits have been doing it for a long time, right? You'd had a secret service since 1909. And you'd also had these constabularies and police forces in your colonies. And so you had this inherited wisdom of, how do you screw your opponents? How do you bribe people? How do you spy? You guys have been doing it for centuries. We were brand new. Russians are more like the Brits. They've been doing this stuff for a long time too, with the Tsar and the Cheka and the communists had their own intelligence force. So the KGB was very good. And in the early days of the Cold War, they just made the CIA look stupid. Kim Philby turned out to be a spy, right? They'd managed to plant a spy at the very top of the British service. And because Philby was very close to Angleton, and Angleton had no idea that he was talking to a Soviet spy, Philby had effectively penetrated the Americans too, at least for a while. So with these successes, and because Angleton knew Philby personally, he took it personally. Angleton went to Allen Dulles in 1954 and he said, look, we need to get serious about counterintelligence, okay? Counterintelligence is the defensive aspect of secret intelligence work, right? Secret intelligence work is espionage, theft of secrets, and covert action. significant manipulations of the other guy to change political reality. Okay, so counterintelligence is trying to stop the other guy from doing that to you. So it's a different way of thinking about what you need to do. And because Angleton was very creative, he realized this was really important. And the CIA was actually they weren't very good at it because they weren't thinking hard about it. And Dulles said that's right. You're right. And so he gave Angleton this counterintelligence staff, which started very small. And Angleton, because he was charismatic and had these very compelling arguments, he quickly built it up. And so the counterintelligence staff becomes his platform. And he's the first chief of counterintelligence, and he's the only one for the next 20 years. So in that position, he outlasts multiple directors. And really, he's the second most powerful man in the CIA. Only the director is more powerful than him. And if the director doesn't come from the CIA, he actually had more power because he actually knew what was going on. What Angleton did was the counterintelligence staff became like a CIA within the CIA, and it had a separate record-keeping system, right? Now, if you think about a central intelligence agency, the one thing that it has to do, if it's going to live up to its name, is you have to centralize intelligence. You have to bring to bear all of this information, get it in one place so that you can go tell the president or tell the generals, here's what's going on with those missiles, or here's what's going on with that government, right? You need to get your good information in one place, figure it out, and lay it on the table for the policymakers. That's the basic job of an intelligence agency. So Angleton didn't have to report to the bigger intelligence agency. He was just within itself. So his operations were utterly secret. They weren't known to the president. They weren't even known to the director sometimes, although he was on friendly terms. So he sort of had a license. He sort of had a blank check from Allen Dulles and then later from Dick Helms. So, but he is running a CIA within a CIA. And from this position, and this is the story that I tell in The Ghost, he becomes one of the most powerful men in the US government, and he is utterly invisible. There's not a dozen people in Washington who actually understand what he's doing, or who even know what he's doing. And so it's a really remarkable story. And so I try to tell it in The Ghost. Like, it's very easy to be judgmental and say this guy's a wicked, horrible person, and that's a perfectly valid. But he was very charismatic, and people really admired him. So I tried hard to understand that, at the same time as being independent and critical and saying this was really crazy. But there was a reason why he got to that position, because he was a very intelligent man, and he was very convincing, and he did a lot of things that a lot of people really liked in the CIA for a long time. Eventually it caught up with him and they kicked him out, and we'll get to that. But in his heyday, which was from 54 to 68, basically, he's one of the most powerful men in the US government. And he's involved in a bunch of things that I talk about in The Ghost, and several of which wind up being factors in the JFK assassination story. But what did Angleton do? Well, first, the Italian elections of 1948, it's kind of the CIA's first big success as a clandestine service. And it's the first of these covert operations where the CIA is setting up and toppling governments all over the world. And in the 50s, they were very successful because nobody saw them coming, and people hadn't learned to, until Fidel Castro came along and kind of figured out how to beat them at their own game. But Angleton's part of that first wave of covert action is this, incredible tool for U.S. foreign policy. In the early 1950s, he also cements an alliance with the Israeli security services, the Mossad in particular, the foreign intelligence service, but also with the Shin Bet, the domestic, Israel's equivalent of the FBI. And so becomes very friendly with the leaders of the Mossad and the Shin Bet. from the start, even friends with David Ben-Gurion, the founder, really the first president of Israel and the founder of it. And Angleton, as part of this, gets Dulles to appoint him to be the desk officer for Israel within the CIA. So he has two jobs. He's the counterintelligence chief and he's the desk officer. So what's a desk officer in the CIA? Well, the way the CIA works is out in the world, you have what's called a station. And this is very much modeled on the British service. You have what's called a station. And that's where you run your CIA operations, from your Bonn station, your Berlin station, your Paris station. So you have a chief of station, and you have a bunch of people working for him. That chief of station reports back to a country desk in Washington, in Langley, Virginia, actually, and says, here's what we're doing, here's what we need, we're keeping the head boss informed, this is going well, this is going badly, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these operations are coordinated in the Langley headquarters. So what Angleton did was he became the Israeli desk officer. So there was a CIA station in Israel, which reported in Tel Aviv, which reported to CIA headquarters in Washington. And so all of those reports went to Angleton. So over here, he's running defensive counterintelligence operations. And over here, he's building up this secret alliance with the Mossad. And he's especially interested in them because people leaving the Soviet Union, especially Jews, would be knowledgeable about what was going on in the Soviet Union. And Angleton thought that they would be a good source of information about the Soviet Union. And so that was one reason why he wanted to build them up. So Angleton becomes a Zionist. And Meir Amit was one of these. Meir Amit was the head of the Mossad in the 60s, from 62 to 68, something like that.
Yeah, the picture of them on Google I was watching.
Yeah, and he says in his biography in Hebrew about the U.S. officials who he dealt with, he said Angleton was the biggest Zionist of the lot. So this strong alliance with Israel is part of Angleton's legacy. Because the KGB was so effective at penetrating CIA operations, and Angleton is trying to stop that, he becomes convinced that the KGB has a mole in Washington, another Philby, somebody who looks like a friend, but who's actually working in the CIA and betraying its secrets. And so Angleton starts to hunt. He launches what is called the mole hunt. And both the American and the British services are obsessed with this question of moles, because there were some spies, especially in the British service in the late 50s and early 60s. And so Angleton is working with his allies in the MI5 and MI6, and they're looking for, is there a mole? Is this person a mole? Can they be trusted? And so eventually this mole hunt turns the CIA inside out. And Angleton is so suspicious that anyone could be a mole that, like, the CIA by 1968 couldn't run any operations in Moscow because Angleton would veto them and say they've been compromised. And so people in the CIA started saying to Dick Helms, who was the director at the time, you got to get rid of this guy. He's just a bottleneck. But the mole hunt was a big part of Angleton's legacy. And it's intimately connected with similar mole hunts in the British services. He was very good friends. Angleton was very good friends with Peter Wright, who was the head of MI5 in this period and wrote a bestseller, a very vivid book called Spycatcher, about his career. But these mole hunts are, they're very debilitating to the, they're bad for morale. People began to say, why are we doing this? And then Angleton and the people around him were even saying Harold Wilson, the British prime minister, the labor minister, prime minister, was a Kremlin agent, because Wilson had contacts with businessmen in Eastern Europe. It was the way you found out about what was going on in the communist world, was you dealt with people in the Soviet bloc, which were, those people were more European. And there was some trade across, across Europe. So Wilson naturally had some Czech businessmen who were friends, something like that. Well, people said, oh, look, he's a Soviet spy. So the mole hunt is another big part of Angleton's legacy. Another thing, and this was something that I don't think is really out in the literature either of Angleton, the CIA, or for that matter, for the Kennedy assassination. And that's Angleton's role in the surveillance of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I tell the story in the book, this idea that you hear, this crazy guy came out of nowhere and killed the president. It's just not true. Angleton was watching Oswald for 4 years before that, constantly. Wherever Lee Harvey Oswald went, within a few weeks, Jim Angleton or his staff would know his whereabouts. And they were reading his mail. They were getting FBI reports on him, State Department reports. So they kept track of this guy all the way to Dallas. And then they said, they turned around and told the Warren Commission, we didn't really know much about him, and we had no indication that he was a threat to the president. The first part of that wasn't true at all. They knew a whole lot about him. He wasn't a lone nut. He was a known quantity. So that fact alone, and I've done some additional reporting on it in JFK Facts this fall, we put together from the records that have been released in recent years, all of the documents that were in the CIA's file on Oswald before November 22nd. So we have the Oswald file as of November 21st, 1963. Okay. This file is controlled by Jim Angleton, not by anybody else in the CIA. And if anybody else in the CIA or another government agency wanted to see it, they would have to get his permission. Okay. This is a tightly controlled document, which tells you something right there. And in that document, there was 180 pages of material on Oswald. What he was doing in the Soviet Union. He married a Russian woman. He wanted to come back. There were articles in the newspaper about his defection. When he came back, the FBI interviewed him. The FBI sent those reports to J. Edgar Hoover, who sent them to his friend, Jim Angleton. So they're keeping up with Oswald everywhere he goes for 4 years. And it's really an amazing story. And, it doesn't get a lot of attention in the conspiracy world because it's not smoking gun proof of a conspiracy. And it's not like, but if you think about it, if you know how the CIA works, it's extraordinary. And what it tells you is they were never held accountable for the events that led to Kennedy's death, right? Let's say the official story is true. I don't believe it. The facts really don't support it. Something else happened, in Dallas. But I mean, even if you say that's what happened, the fact that one of the top men in the CIA knew that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Texas on November 8th, 1963. If that had been known to the Warren Commission, James Angleton would have lost his job instantly. Like the lady from the Secret Service lost her job after Trump almost got killed. It was like, it's over for you, right? It's just period. You're out the window. Well, that never happened. Nobody knew who Angleton was. Nobody knew. The Warren Commission was deceived. Angleton's boss and friend, Dick Helms, lied to Angleton's friend and former boss, Alan Dulles, a member of the commission, and said, oh, we didn't know anything about Oswald. And they got that on the record, right? It was a preposterous lie. And so right there, that the record is contaminated. And it's not by, one hand didn't know what the other hand was doing, or, all the usual excuses, right? Those excuses don't apply. And so that's an amazing story. And that's part of, the Angleton legacy. And this is
let me just pause you there. So viewers, if you have tuned in, I am with Jefferson Morley. He's the author of The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spymaster James Jesus Angleton. I'm putting the links in the live chat right now. This is a fascinating journey that he's taking on. We do possibly have coming on soon as well from Minsk, Russia, Ernst Tisovitz, who was Oswald's best friend while
excellent,
he was out
excellent.
there.
I've had Ernst on my podcast, and Ernst is a really good guy and a really good man, very interesting man, so impressive. You know, a practicing biomedical scientist in his mid-80s. He is so sharp, so sharp.
Yeah.
And his, I recommend, I plug my books on your show, but I will plug Ernst's book too. Oswald Russian Episode, which you can get on Amazon, is Ernst's account of his friendship with this young man, Lee Harvey Oswald. It's one of the best books about the JFK story because you see it through human eyes. You see Oswald through human eyes, and you understand why he said he was a patsy. And Ernst really, you know, incredible research, well-told story, perceptive about people and Oswald himself. So that's great to have him.
All right. Before we continue then, viewers, put a 1 in the chat if you think JFK was assassinated by a lone nut job gunman. Put a 2 in the chat if you think there was a much broader conspiracy involving the CIA and Angleton. So earlier on, you said that there were certain events that led up to JFK's assassination. Could you take us through that, please?
Yeah. So contrary to the story that the Warren Commission was told that we only had minimal information about this guy, the CIA knows a whole lot about him, and all this information is being funneled to Angleton's office. In Oswald's short life, okay, in fact, in the last 18 months of his life, he encounters or is picked up, detected by 5 different CIA operations, and 6 total. The first one is when he goes to the Soviet Union. Angleton starts reading his mail. He puts Oswald's name on a list of people whose mail is to be opened. That was a secret operation called, with the code name HT Lingual. Okay. Now, that was the first operation that CIA operation that Oswald is documented to have been encountered. And in the spring of 1963, a second operation picks up on Oswald. It's a CIA operation called Am Santa. And Am Santa is an operation to penetrate a leftist group, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was set up on college campuses to defend the Cuban Revolution from American efforts to overthrow them and to say, leave Cuba alone. You know, they have the right to experiment with a socialist country. Really the beginning of the new left in America. And so the CIA and the FBI, they want to destroy this group because it's critical of US policy. And so they infiltrate it and they spy on them, they steal their mail. So that Am Santa starts in the spring of 1963, and within a month, they have intercepted Lee Harvey Oswald's mail to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Oswald, at this point, has come back from the Soviet Union. He's kind of disillusioned with communism, which a story that Ernst Tisovitz tells well. But he's interested in Cuban socialism. That's kind of different than the Russians. And so he writes to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and says he wants to go public. Well, the CIA now has his correspondence and his name and his address. So later that summer, Oswald goes public on behalf of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And he hands out pamphlets on the street in New Orleans, on Canal Street, the big street of the heart of New Orleans, where he gets into a fight with a bunch of anti-Castro students, right? He's defending the Cuban Revolution. These guys are very anti-Castro. They get in a fight, they get arrested. And then when they go to court, there's a confrontation in the courtroom. TV cameras are there. This is like a little bit of drama. A communist fighting with anti-communists in the streets of New Orleans. And then Oswald does it again. He's captured on TV. And these anti-Castro exiles challenge him to a debate on the radio, which Oswald accepts. And so Oswald's got his message out with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Well, the group that confronted Oswald was called the Cuban Student Directorate. And this was one of the first things that I discovered in my reporting when I started reporting the 1990s, which people didn't really know before, which was the people who called attention to Oswald before Kennedy's assassination were funded by the CIA. They were paid CIA agents. That's not a smear or something. We have the documents. And I interviewed a lot of these guys, and they said, "Yeah, we work for the CIA, sure." So anyway, that operation, the Cuban Student Directorate, that was the third CIA covert operation that picked up on Oswald. It was called AmSpell. So Oswald now has a public reputation as a leftist. And some newspaper clips to his credit. And within a month, he goes to Mexico City, takes a bus to Mexico City from New Orleans, and goes to the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy and says, "I want to go to Cuba, and then from Cuba, I want to go to the Soviet Union where I used to live." And so he applies for a visa, and the Cubans say, "We're not going to give you a visa to go to Cuba until you have your other visa." So he goes to the Soviet consulate. These offices are spied on constantly by the CIA, 1 or 2 cameras at all times. The facilities themselves are wiretapped. All the phones in there are wiretapped. So the CIA has eyeballs on everybody going in there, and they're listening to every conversation that takes place. So when Oswald goes to the Soviet Union and to ask for his visa, there's a camera in an apartment across the street. And that's another covert operation that picks up on Oswald called Lee Empty. And this was a fixed photo camera that took a picture of every person who came and went from the Cuban embassy. And then he gets on the phone and he's talking to the people in the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy. And those lines are bugged by another secret operation called Lee Envoy. And so they have his voice on tape. So they've got pictures of him. They've got his voice on tape. And then when all of this information is sent back to the to CIA headquarters, where it's analyzed by Angleton's people, the documents in CIA headquarters are marked with the code name for another CIA operation, the 6th one, that young Lee Harvey Oswald, the young and doomed Lee Harvey Oswald, has run across in his short life. And that was an operation called LC Improve, which was a code name for operations against the KGB. So in the course of 4 years, Oswald is targeted, has intelligence collected on him by 6 different CIA operations. So my friends who say this it's all very innocent, they just screwed up, they're just covering their asses, that's impossible for me to believe, right? This idea that, the CIA, they're incompetent, they can't be it. I read 3 books about the CIA, about very powerful men in the CIA. You spend a lot of time looking at these organizations. Incompetent is not the first word that comes to your mind. That's like the last thing they are, right? They do stupid things for sure, and they fail for sure, but they're not incompetent in general. No, that can't be your premise. Your premise has to be that they are competent, because you don't get to be a $15 billion a year agency. And that's what the CIA is, as last we knew, by being incompetent. You get there by being powerful and doing stuff that the president of the United States wants done. So Oswald is picked up by all of these operations, and all the intelligence is going back to these people at the top of the CIA. And then Oswald is arrested for killing the president. When in doing my research for my first book, I was reading the transcript of a CIA officer who had testified behind closed doors in the 70s. And the testimony wasn't released until the 90s. This was part of all these new records that came in. And I was reading this guy's testimony, and it was good. He was, compared to most of these CIA guys, he was kind of candid. other guys, they're just lying their asses off. You can tell, or being evasive, selective, not answering candidly. This guy was kind of candid, and he was talking about CIA headquarters on November 22nd. He said, we were all, we were glued to the radio. We'd heard the news from Dallas. Oh my God, the president's been killed. He said, and then the name came over and a suspect had been arrested, Lee Harvey Oswald. And this guy said, the effect was electric. And when I read that, like the effect on me was, how your hair stands on end, because you realized they recognized the name, right? Everybody else is going, Oswald, never heard of anybody. Inside CIA headquarters was like, oh my God, they knew that they were on very thin ice. And what my research has shown, and you can find this on one of the best read stories on JFK Facts, and it's on the right-hand side of the front page, is Angleton had 180 pages on the guy. At least a dozen to 15 different CIA offices had signed for one or more documents about him. The chiefs of these offices, the Soviet Russia division, the counterintelligence operations office. I mean, so, hundreds of pages about this guy who supposedly just killed the president has circulated in a dozen offices and been seen by probably 3 or 4 dozen people were well acquainted with Lee Harvey Oswald's biography. And some of them at the very top of the CIA. So that's an amazing story that was totally unknown. And I start to tell it in The Ghost. And but here's the thing, Sean, and this is why this moment is significant and important. One of the documents that's still secret is testimony that James Angleton gave in the 1970s. After he had been fired, he'd been disgraced, he'd been caught spying on Americans. And Seymour Hersh, the famous investigative reporter, exposed him in a famous story in the New York Times. And William Colby, the director of the CIA, fired Angleton, this guy who was basically untouchable. And Colby fired him. And it was a triple-decker headline in the New York Times. And it launched all these investigations into the CIA, the most serious investigation of the CIA ever, the Church Committee. So Angleton is humiliated. He's this, he's been this spy. Nobody knew who he was, and all of a sudden he's got TV crews camped out on his lawn. It was. You can imagine, he's not a particularly sympathetic man, but you could sympathize with him in that way. It was like having your pants pulled down in public. It's like, so. When the Church Committee come to him and they're like, they want to explain yourself, tell us what you were doing, because we had no idea. And, he's kind of disgraced. But himself, he wants to get in there and say why he's totally right. And the commies are coming and, you didn't listen to me. And so he's kind of a cranky old man, but he's dying to speak his mind. And so they take him behind closed doors and they start asking about the Israel account and Oswald and the mole hunt and all this stuff. So a lot of Angleton's testimony to the Church Committee has been declassified in its entirety. But there's one session where they were doing the most sensitive stuff that's heavily redacted. And that's one of the documents that Trump and Biden protected. So it's one of the most important documents out there. And if Trump makes it public, we are going to have big news. And people ask me all the time, is there a smoking gun, Jeff? Is there a smoking gun? I'm always embarrassed for people when they ask that question, because I was a police reporter a couple of times in my career. One time coming up and another time when I made a mistake and we got kicked downstairs, okay? And you go cover cops, Jeff. So I covered the cops. If you ever went in and said, to the public affairs officer, is there a smoking gun in that homicide over there in Dallas? They would have said, get your rookie ass out of here. They wouldn't have even talked to you. Like, it's a ridiculous question in a homicide. Is there a smoking gun? It's like a TV question. It's like, it's not something that you would ask in the real world without really embarrassing yourself. Now, if you do talk to a homicide detective, what do they tell you? If you go to them and say, well, you got a theory? No, that's not the way detectives work. Usually they won't say anything. All they'd say to me is, I'd say, well, what do you think happened? It was some homicide, And they'd say, go read the docket, Go read all of the publicly available information. And so then you go do that and you come back and I don't know. You got a theory? And the detective would say, well, what's the fact pattern? Because when the prosecutors come to the cops, that's what they say. What's the fact pattern here? So no theories. Let's go for the fact pattern, okay? And the fact pattern is the official story is not true, okay? It did not happen that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots at the presidential limousine, 2 of which missed, 1 of which went through Kennedy and John Connally, and the 3rd hit Kennedy. That's not what happened according to the evidence, according to the photographic evidence, the medical evidence, the bystander evidence. So what did happen? Well, the fact pattern looks like some kind of covert operation to make it look like Oswald killed the president when somebody else did it. And supporting that theory is Oswald himself, who said, I didn't do it. I'm a patsy, right? He didn't say, I didn't do it. That's ridiculous. It's a very interesting comment. I'm a patsy. I'm a fall guy. I'm taking the blame for something that these other people did. Well, who are those other people? Oswald could never explain himself because he was executed in police custody. But the fact pattern, looking at it, and I've been writing about this seriously for 30 years, and I don't have a theory. I do have a fact pattern. And the fact pattern points to some kind of secret operation by enemies of Kennedy's policies in his own government, who had the ability to make this thing look like something else. And that's not ridiculous. That's what the CIA does, That's what a covert operation is. So that's what this looks like. And I was very, very influenced by a CIA officer who came to speak at a conference in Dallas in 2019, retired CIA officer. And he gave his take on the Kennedy assassination. Now, he was not speaking from personal knowledge. He joined the CIA in the 80s, coming out of West Point. So he had no knowledge. He never saw anything or anything like that. It was not that kind of analysis. It was not historical analysis. It was kind of functional analysis. And to him, he said, this looks like a covert operation. And if you reverse engineer it, how would it have worked? And Rolf, that's his name, real name, Rolf said, one thing you need to understand about CIA operations is some of the most successful operations, to this day, that were done under George W. Bush or Barack Obama. He said some of the most successful, important operations were only known to 3 or 4 people. The entire existence of them, the whole operation was only known. So a covert operation can be very tightly held. People say, well, somebody would have talked. Not if nobody knows anything, right? If you've got that tight core, and I think that Rolf is basically right about that as a way of thinking about what happened in Dallas. So that's kind of what I think the fact pattern is. And, we've got these documents that are remaining out there. Now, we know a lot about these documents, and no, there's not probably one piece of evidence that is going to change your mind. But if you're not looking for a smoking gun, if you're looking for pieces of the mosaic, we're going to get some important pieces of the mosaic. I'll put it that way. If we get full disclosure, which I don't think is assured yet. So it's an exciting time. I think we're going to learn significant new information about JFK's assassination in the next year. It's possible in a way that it has not been possible before.
Great. You've got tons of questions coming, but my first question for you is what's the story behind Angleton's downfall?
So what happened was during the Watergate scandal, a group of men were arrested in the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Turned out they'd been working for the White House. Turned out 6 of the 7 were former CIA people. So, and then, which the CIA, led by Director Helms, said they were retired. We had nothing to do with them, which was not true. In fact, as I show in my other book, Scorpion's Dance, which is about Richard Helms and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, the president, Richard Helms, the director of the CIA. Basically, it was Helms who gave a burglary team to Nixon. Howard Hunt was a close personal friend of Richard Helms. And Nixon is raging against his enemies, Daniel Ellsberg, and, I need somebody who can, help me go after these lefty commies, And Helms was very good friends with Hunt. And Helms is a very smooth, urbane, kind of bland man. But he knew that Hunt was a rabble rouser, fire breather like Nixon, And he thought, yeah, Nixon will like this, my friend Hunt, because he's really tough and anti-communist. And so that's how, within a week, you can hear on the Watergate tape, Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff for Nixon, they're, what do we do? What do we do about this guy Ellsberg? And can't we get somebody on the case? And Haldeman says, well, Helms has got this guy Hunt, says he's quiet, ruthless, careful. And within a week, Howard Hunt is working at the White House. And within a year, he's arrested at the Watergate. So the CIA, as the Watergate scandal unfolds, people begin to realize Helms kept a lot of the story secret, but parts of it came out. And so the CIA was kind of embarrassed. And Nixon brought in his new CIA director, James Schlesinger, who was an economist, was not a spook. And Schlesinger said, look, I'm tired of these scandals. If you know anything anywhere in the CIA about something that, wouldn't look good on the front page of a newspaper, please send it to me. And so people in the CIA sent in stuff. And one of the things that a lot of people complained about was Angleton's domestic spying program. Angleton was spying on the anti-war movement. They had like 30 agents infiltrating the anti-war movement, which President Johnson wanted to know, are communists behind all of these demonstrations and all that stuff? Johnson was sure it was a commie plot. Americans couldn't possibly be protesting against the war on their own. Mm-hmm. So the CIA went out and investigated, and, sure enough, the communist countries, they loved it, but they weren't funding it. They weren't controlling it. They weren't directing it. They were encouraging it. But anyway, the CIA kept on trying to infiltrate, kept on looking for this, and so in the 1970s, like a lot of people wrote in when Schlesinger said, send in your memo. And they said, we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be spying on people. We can spy on people overseas, but we shouldn't be spying on it. And remember, this is the Vietnam War era. I mean, these CIA guys are like, I'm spying on my wife and kids. That's basically what we're doing, right? Because even CIA families were split over the war. So there's a bunch of paper inside the CIA of all these abuses of power, and the domestic spying is one of them. Mind control experiments, another. And so Bill Colby, the director of the CIA, shows this to people on Capitol Hill and says, look, I fired Angleton, and we have this problem, but we're going to clean it up. And Colby tries to demote Angleton. He takes the Israel account away from him. He doesn't have veto power over operations. So Angleton's losing his power. One of the people who didn't like Angleton in the CIA hierarchy had all of these papers, which came to be known as the family jewels, because they were very valuable, right? Valuable secrets. And this official shared the family jewels with Seymour Hersh, the famous investigative reporter who was then a reporter for the New York Times. So it was the leak of the family jewels to Seymour Hersh that sealed Angleton's. Because then Hersh had the whole story of what had happened. He went back to Colby and said, is this true? Was your guy really spying? And Colby, who had wanted to get rid of Angleton for a long time, said, yeah, it's true. And so then Hersh knew the story was true. It was gold-plated because the CIA director himself had said it was true. And the Times ran it big. Angleton was toast. So that's how Angleton came to his end. And then other stuff, didn't emerge. The story of Angleton and Oswald was not known until the 1990s.
Wow. All right, I'll try and get some viewer questions in.
Let's see what people have to say. I'm interested.
All right. Mano's asking, Oswald was a defector to Russia, yet he walked back into the USA without a blink. How and why? No questions asked.
Yeah, I mean, great question. People who had done what Oswald did, go to live in the Soviet Union for a while and come back, typically when they came back, they would be taken aside and they would be questioned quite carefully, but typically 2 or 3 days of nonstop questioning, everything they knew about it. Okay. And we know that a guy named Robert Webster went to the Soviet Union. He had worked at the RAND Corporation, a think tank associated with the Defense Department. He went to the Soviet Union in 1959 for personal reasons and returned in 1962, just like Oswald. When Webster came home, he gave this intense debriefing, and then they forgot about him. They had all the information and they didn't care anything else. With Oswald, it was exactly the opposite. They didn't interview him, and they still kept track of him, and they watched him wherever he went. So why, Oswald had a security clearance, and the State Department had noted that when he talked about why he was going to the Soviet Union, that he would share military information with the Soviet Union, or he was willing to. Now, the FBI, when FBI officials saw this, they asked him about it, and when State Department officials saw it, they said, "Did you talk to anybody?" And Oswald said, "No, I didn't talk to anybody. Nobody asked me for information." The CIA, if you look at all the paperwork around Oswald, there's never a line like that from the CIA. They did not view him as a security threat. State Department did. They said, better ask him about that. FBI, what's going on there? They wanted to know. CIA didn't want to know. So that's a tip-off to Mano. Angleton's, people say, is he a false defector? He was an assisted defector. You help a guy get over there. Oswald was genuinely left-wing in his views, right? He believed in socialism. He came from a poor family, and Ernst Titovitz talks, so he sincerely wants to go there. It's not like Lee pretend to be a communist and go to the Soviet Union on a spy mission. That's not how the CIA works. So he seems to have been helped getting over there and getting back. So the bottom line is he's not treated as a security threat, which is a tip-off that he has some other status in the eyes of people at the top of the CIA.
Thank you. So Anne, was
yes.
Oswald's wife innocent, or was she an asset for either side?
I think she's innocent. Marina Oswald Porter is still alive, lives in Texas, a grandmother, and has not believed for a long time that her first husband, Lee, killed the president. So Marina's innocent of anything related to the assassination of President Kennedy, just as her husband wasn't entirely innocent, but he didn't kill the president. Was she an asset for the other side? I mean, the FBI looked at it. Marina Oswald's phone was bugged for 10 years by Angleton after the Kennedy assassination. They never found any evidence that she was some kind of intelligence operative. So no, I don't think she was an asset, and I do think she was innocent. Owen Smith, will they release Oswald's tax records? It's a good question, because the JFK Records Act that was passed by Congress had an exemption in it, and it said all these records have to be made public, but not IRS records. The IRS is very vigilant about, under most circumstances, protecting the personal information of taxpayers. That's how you win the confidence that your information is not going to be abused. So they have that provision written into law. And this is a question that's facing Trump, is like, when Trump says we need full and complete, does that mean we get these tax records or not? They'll be interesting to see. Again, I don't think they'll be decisive, but they might shed some light on if Oswald continued to get paid by the Defense Department after he went to the Soviet Union in some like in a reserve capacity or something like that, that would be another indicator that he was a supported defector.
So
Tracy,
Tracy's wondering, will the police reports on Oswald's interviews be part of the files?
All the police reports on Oswald's interviews have been released. We have those in their entirety. What's striking about those is that Oswald is interviewed in the first 2 days after the assassination. There's no tape recording of his things, despite the fact that the Dallas police were supposed to tape record interviews with homicide suspects. But we do have the written notes of the FBI agents and the Dallas police officers who sat in on that. I should say that if people are interested in these kind of questions and want to learn more, the website of the Mary Ferrell Foundation, and Ferrell is Ferrell, maryferrell.org, one word. That has a complete collection, or the biggest online collection of JFK assassination records, 1 million pages, and it's very well organized. You can search by day. You know, if you don't really know the story, there's a little thing called starting points, and there's a bunch of essays which will lead you into this, you know, admittedly a very complicated and strange set of events, and try and understand it. And so that's a good place to people go to answer questions like this. Are Oswald's DD-14 and other military records publicly available? Yes, but, and this is where another question that's up for Trump is, we have a lot of records like Oswald's military records, but there's also stuff that's known to exist that has not been put in the JFK collection. The agencies never acknowledged that this was assassination related, or that they couldn't find it, or something like that. So, will Trump go after additional records like that, like especially around Oswald's military status? That's what we'll see when we see the Trump plan. When are we actually going to see the files? Good question. I mean, we're going to see the plan, and we might start to see files right away. I think this is a good index of how fast this process is moving. If we don't see stuff right away, we'll know that the CIA has its foot on the brake. And then, for the JFK research community, and we have a list, there's a dozen or so records that are, we know are important. And so those are kind of our benchmark for this release. If we get all 12 of those records, we know this is a good process. If we get that Angleton Church Committee testimony, we know this is a good process. If we get another key document that might possibly have a smoking gun in it, is the personnel file of one of the CIA officers involved in the surveillance of Oswald. This is called the Joanides file. That was the name of George Joanides, was the CIA officer involved in the surveillance of Oswald. So, do we get the whole Joanides file? That's the test, and it's not the number of documents that are released. Are all the documents released? That's the only test, because if you let them keep something, I mean, you have to assume that they're going to hide something damaging. I'm sorry, that's not cynical. That's the reality of Washington. And that's why we have this law. And that's why Trump's trying to do it. It's like, cut the crap and put it all out there. And, when people understand, when they see how long this has taken, how difficult it is, they can have a sense of what's going on, right? Which is, there's, secretive agencies have this power to keep secrets, and even about Kennedy's assassination, even 60 years later. And we're coming to the crunch time, and Trump's order is a good thing, but this is not a done deal. Do you think most of what they have will still be? No, the whole point is, if it's released, it's unredacted. We have redacted documents right now. That Angleton transcript is heavily redacted. We want the whole thing without any redactions. Same thing with the Joanides file. We know the documents that are completely withheld in that file. We want to see all of those documents. Did the Dallas Police Department conduct their own homicide investigation? No, they did not. The investigation was taken away from them, which in a legal sense was improper, because in 1963, it was not a federal offense to assassinate the president. It was the crime under existing law was of Texas law, of Texas homicide law. So the autopsy should have taken place in Texas legally, and the investigation should have been conducted by the Dallas police. But that wasn't going to happen. Obviously, the breakdown in security, where the president shot in broad daylight, the Dallas Police Department wasn't going to be trusted with doing its own investigation. So they did not conduct their own investigation, and they reached no conclusions. Back to Mono, JFK was going to make many changes: Cuba, Russia, Vietnam. Would USA have gone to Vietnam if JFK was in office? I mean, we'll never know, right? But JFK thought about Vietnam very differently than Lyndon Johnson did. That's very clear. And U.S. policy changed as soon as Johnson became president and became much more Pentagon friendly. Now, people say JFK put 18,000 advisors into Vietnam, and he escalated, and he wasn't pulling out, and he was a cold warrior, and just like Johnson. The historiography of the period now shows that's not true. Kennedy really was resisting pressure. He was resisting pressure to turn those advisors into combat troops. He was seeking to create a policy option of withdrawal starting as soon as he won re-election after the 1964 election. So, yes, Kennedy's approach to Vietnam and Russia was definitely different, and would have gone a different direction. And this is why people still care about this, because Kennedy offered a vision of America in the world that is, was unique at the time and is even unique now. Kennedy in 1963 said in a famous speech at American University, "We do not want a Pax Americana." Okay, we don't want to impose America's idea of peace on the world. No person running for president has said anything like that except Donald Trump, who's like, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something else. We're going to do deals for me and my buddies. But that's not like we're going to rule. We're not going to be the world's policeman. Well, Kennedy was the one who wanted to turn off that path. And when there was no accountability for Kennedy's death, and I think that his enemies in his own government who opposed these policies killed him, they had impunity. They had a free hand. And U.S. policy as a result became more aggressive, more militaristic, a trend that continues to this day. So I think that that's why Kennedy's death still matters, and why the accountability still matters, because people feel like they were cheated out of something. And that's a very strong feeling in American politics and political culture today. Any opinion on James Earl Files? James Earl Files was a man who claimed that he was a gunman in Dealey Plaza. I've checked out his story. I mean, might be true. I don't see any corroboration for it, and it strikes me as unlikely. So I don't put any stock in it, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that. How believable is the off-state the Dulles brothers orchestrated the assassination? This is not a rumor. One of the best recent biography of Allen Dulles, The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot, is an excellent survey of Dulles's career. And David argues that Dulles was kind of a chairman of the board and kind of gave the nod for Kennedy's assassination. So it's not a rumor. It's a plausible interpretation of what happened. It doesn't include John Foster Dulles. It does include Allen. And, Allen Dulles was very hostile to Kennedy. Allen Dulles was fired by Kennedy. And Allen Dulles somehow wound up on the Warren Commission, where he protected the CIA's interests and really obstructed the investigation. So, I don't say that Allen Dulles was responsible for the assassination of President Kennedy. I do say President Kennedy was killed by enemies in his own government, enemies of his policies, and Allen Dulles could have been one of those people. But I wouldn't say anything more than that. Could have.
Who was the slippery guy in the JFK movie, Clay?
Clay Shaw was a New Orleans businessman who Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney played by Kevin Costner in the movie, prosecuted, saying that he was a CIA agent and he was involved in a conspiracy to kill the president. Clay Shaw came to trial and was swiftly acquitted. Garrison didn't have much of a case at all, it turned out. At the time, the CIA denied that Clay Shaw was a CIA agent. And they said, well, he was a businessman, and when he returned from overseas, we'd ask him what he saw, but he was unpaid. He was just a friendly person, friendly American. Hold on one sec. Well, when JFK records started coming out in the 1990s, out pops the CIA memo. It says, oh, we checked the file on Clay Shaw, and yes, he was a, quote, highly paid contract agent. So Jim Garrison was right. He was a contract agent. So he was a slippery guy. He was a CIA. He did stuff for the CIA, but I don't think he had anything to do with Kennedy's assassination. He might have been. He did have some dealings with Oswald, and he might have been a kind of babysitter, what's called a babysitter in intelligence work, where you're in proximity to somebody and you're friendly with them so that you know about like what they're doing. But Clay Shaw was not like, the intellectual author of Kennedy's death. J.R. Williams, Dorothy Kilgallen. Dorothy Kilgallen was a very well-known columnist in the 1960s, became very interested in the Kennedy assassination, talked to Jack Ruby, and said, she was going to break open the story. And right after, as people began to read the Warren Commission in 1964, 1965, and read all the evidence, they began to say what I think is now self-evident, that this story doesn't hang together. It's not logical. It's self-interested. It's biased. It's just not true. And so a lot of people were saying that we need a new investigation. It wasn't just conspiracy theorists, quote unquote. It was Life magazine, one of the biggest publications in the country, called for a new investigation. So Dorothy Kilgallen is part of this first wave of skeptics. And then she dies. She dies of a drug overdose. And people have been saying, question, was she bumped off? I have not investigated it. And the circumstances are murky, but people who knew her could not believe that that's how she died. So I think there's definitely a possibility of foul play. There will not be anything about Dorothy Kilgallen in the stuff that's released in the weeks and months to come. JR, why would any hold on to proof or put information on paper that could incriminate the CIA in a real coup that took out a sitting president? Yeah, this is a good question, right? When you're doing a covert operation, you never write it down, right? But here's the thing, and this is important for people to remember, because people say this all the time. Oh, Jeff, didn't they destroy incriminating stuff a long time ago? Why, there's nothing in there. There's nothing in there. Again, if you know how the CIA works, that's not the case. And I'll go back to the Oswald file, okay, that we compiled. We were actually able to do that working off of a list that the CIA itself had made in 1978 when Congress reopened the investigation. So at this point, there was no Oliver Stone movie. There were questions about JFK's assassination. The Zapruder film had been shown on TV, and people saw the president's head flying backwards, and they said, is that really a shot from behind? So there was this, but Congress was reopening the investigation, and the CIA internally had to organize. Well, okay, they're going to come here and ask us certain questions. They want to talk to people. They want to see certain documents. So we got to get organized and how to deal with them. And so they start collecting all of this stuff, and they say, oh, well, what did we have on Oswald? Okay, well, they go through and they add all these things up and they put it in one place, and they say, at that point, the people collecting that document, they had no reason to doubt the lone gunman theory. The CIA had vouched for it. There was no evidence of CIA involvement with Oswald. They didn't know anything about Jim Angleton being all over him. So if you don't know something is incriminating, you can't destroy it because it's incriminating. And once you save it, it's saved for good. They can't go destroy those records now because there's more than one copy and people have seen them. So it's not true that all incriminating records have been destroyed. Incriminating records that people didn't know were incriminating have survived. And that's why we understand much more about the Kennedy assassination than we did even 10 years ago, because incriminating stuff does survive, even though it seems counterintuitive.
Jeff, we're at 90 minutes. There's still tons of questions outstanding. Do you have time, or are we, have you got to get on with your life?
Let's answer a few more. Let's answer a few more.
Or you let me know when you've had enough. Okay.
A book that RFK Jr. recommended. Is it true that the CIA had another patsy lined up before Oswald and that they nearly shot JFK one month before earlier in Chicago? Let's leave the CIA out of it. The Secret Service in Chicago did hear reliable reports that President Kennedy might be assassinated on a visit to Chicago on November 1st, 1963. President Kennedy was going to Chicago and was going to go to attend a football game. And the motorcade route had been worked out. And it turned out that the motorcade route went through a sharp turn, like happened in Dallas, and that this people who were suspected of somehow maybe sort of could be possibly being involved were associated with that building. And so the story of the so-called Chicago plot was suppressed within the Secret Service after Kennedy was killed. And one of the shameful things that happened after Kennedy was killed, and a sure sign of a cover-up, is the one man in the Secret Service who tried to call attention to lax security and to the Chicago plot was a man named Abraham Bolden. He was the first African-American Secret Service agent. And after Kennedy was killed, he went to his superiors and said, look, there's a lot of things we need to address here. Because he had one of the things, as one of the Secret Service agents, he had been told to interview some people about the possible Chicago plot. So he knew about it. J. Edgar Hoover and the Secret Service turned around and framed him. What they did was they took his dealings with an undercover agent and made it seem like he was taking bribes instead of that he was working with the informant to get information. So they really screwed him. Abe Bolden lost his job, went to jail, and nobody ever knew about the Chicago plot. But when he got out, he started talking about it. JFK researchers picked up on it, and yes, the story is real. There really was a Chicago plot, it was completely covered up at the time. So
sleeper cells.
This is one of these kind of conspiracy theory questions. It doesn't have anything to do with JFK, so I can't answer it, and I won't answer it. It's not relevant to what happened in Dallas, and or what's going on today. That is not the right way to think about it. That's conspiracy think, and is not helpful in understanding the JFK story. What was L. Harvey doing there? I guess this is what was Lee Harvey Oswald doing at the scene of the crime. He worked in the building from which some gunfire came. Nobody saw him firing a gun that day. So he was there. And, like I said, after he's arrested for the crime, he says, I didn't shoot the president. I'm a patsy. So Oswald's behavior around the book depository is curious. He was a guy who was very interested in politics and liked President Kennedy, told his wife and friends that he admired the president in certain ways. And yet he's not out there on the street, like looking when the president's going by. Seems out of character. Like he had something else on his mind. So Oswald's acting suspiciously. I think that he had guilty knowledge of something. So I think that's what he was doing there. But since he was killed, it's hard to say anything more than that. What was Oswald going to say when facing the electric chair? I mean, I don't think Oswald would have been convicted. over the years, various law schools and bar associations have sponsored mock trials of Oswald, right? And the idea is you give a prosecution team all of the evidence, and you give a defense team all of the evidence, and you kind of relitigate the assassination. So this has happened 7 times over the years. So it's a kind of a test, and it's a more rigorous than like, an online poll, right? Because you have a jury of like law students, and so they acquaint themselves with the evidence, and then they have to vote and all that. In 6 of those 7 cases ended with Oswald acquitted or in a hung jury. So if you really get into the guts of the evidence, I don't think Oswald would have been convicted. The evidence connecting him to the gun. So I don't think he would have been facing the electric chair. That's not what would have happened. What would have happened with Oswald on the stand was he would have been asked how he got to the Soviet Union and how he got back. And then you'd be right in the heart of those 6 CIA operations all around him. And that was unthinkable for the CIA. So when I was on Piers Morgan the other day, there was a guy on who I'd never heard before. He had been in organized crime. He'd been like a made man in the mafia. And I think he flipped and became state's witness. And now he talks about life in the mafia. And he said, and I'd never heard this before, but his testimony was very vivid. He said when he was talking to these capos and bosses and capo to capo and, all the crime world guys who he dealt with all over the country, he said the standard thing, the understanding, the common wisdom was that the mafia had been asked to get rid of Lee Oswald, and that they had gotten Jack Ruby, this nightclub owner, whose greatest dream was to be one of those organized crime dudes, and got him to kill Oswald. So that, to me, that underscored the organized crime role in the plot. People say, was organized crime involved? Yes. They got Jack Ruby to kill Lee Oswald. That's the organized crime part of the plot. The CIA did not organize that business of shooting people with rifles from a moving target from far away. That's not how the mafia kills people, right? The mafia blows up your car or gives you cement shoes, or shoots you in the back of the head with your hands tied. They don't do precision military operations. So organized crime, yes, part of what happened, but not the main actor. Do I think that Henry Kissinger was involved? No. Next question. Rob Reiner's podcast. I recommend for people who want a good deep dive into the JFK story, not too heavy, not crazy, very well documented. Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien's podcast from Who Killed JFK, available on all the podcast platforms. I think it's quite excellent. I'm a little biased because I'm interviewed in 3 or 4 of the segments, but it's a very good thing. So I like that. Do I think Sirhan was hypnotized? I'm not an expert in RFK's assassination, so I don't want to talk about that. What are my views on J.D. Tippit? J.D. Tippit was the Dallas police officer who was killed on the day of the assassination, allegedly by Lee Oswald. I think that J.D. Tippit was killed by Lee Oswald. Although why he was hunting for Oswald at that time, at that moment, is very interesting, because at that moment, pretty much every Dallas cop was in Dealey Plaza. And J.D. Tippit's out cruising around near Lee Oswald's house. So curious. That's what I think about J.D. Tippit.
Jeff, it's nearly midnight here in the UK. You've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate you answering all these questions. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the chance to get JFK Facts on Substack in front of people. If this has been an interesting conversation, sign up for free. You'll get a lot of the content. If you sign up for $5 a month, you'll get all of it, including some great reporting about what's about to happen. So
Jeff's links are in the live chat right now. And if you're watching on replay, the links are in the description box. So please go and support his work and get the book. You'll get way more details and get more questions answered. So,
Sean, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Take care, my friend. You have a great night. Cheers. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Right. What a fantastic guest. I mean, that was just good grief, the journey he took us on, so detailed, such a wealth of information. And I'm sure there are tons more in his book. Again, I'm just going to put the link in the live chat. Thank you for all your questions. As usual, you help shape the evening and make my job much easier. Don't have to be thinking of so many questions. Thank you. And we are back tomorrow night with Ori Spado, former mob boss, mafia in Hollywood. He has got an exclusive getting released tomorrow morning with a prison guard of Diddy, who's having to remain disguised. And then he's coming on our channel to talk about it. And he's also served time in MDC. And he's a proper old school mafia gentleman. So get your questions ready for that one, folks. It's at 8 p.m. UK tomorrow. Ron's got tons of shows. Tomorrow, again, he's got his daily show, etc. So we will be back. We did try and get through most of the questions. Thank you very much for sending them in. But save them for Ernst Tivitz. It was Michael Francis, he was talking about, who we brought out here on tour earlier in the year. But Ernst Tivitz is going to be coming on live from Minsk, Russia. His internet is so dodgy, it's going to be audio only, but you're going to have a unique opportunity to ask Ernst, who was Oswald's best friend in Russia, questions. Hopefully, we'll get that on by the weekend. But we're going down this rabbit hole while everyone's talking about the files getting declassified. But yeah, so hope to see some of you tomorrow with Ori Spado. Take care wherever you are in the world.